A very warm welcome to another live Action for Happiness event. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us, as always. And it's a great delight to welcome our special guest this evening, Oliver Burkeman, who I'm delighted to have back for another Action for Happiness event. We last did one together, I think something like 7 or 8 years ago, Oliver. So it's great to see you again.
Hi. Thank you very much for inviting me back. I'm really pleased to be here.
We've talked about this theme for today being embrace your limits, and I'm really excited to um, check in with you on this because your work has been a big inspiration for me, and I know many in this community. Before Oliver and I start our conversation, to all of you out there watching us live, thank you for being here. From all around the world, as is always the case. Let's keep any contributions on the chat positive, constructive, relevant to today's conversation. And please do use the Q&A function because after we've had a conversation, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions to Oliver. And I know he's looking forward to responding to all the wise things you'll be wanting to ask. And we'll also be having a chance to share a few things interactively on the chat as we go along as well. So Oliver, as I'm sure you know, is a fantastic author of many great books. And perhaps where many of us came across you first, Oliver, was writing that brilliant column, This Column Can Change Your Life for The Guardian, where I guess, correct me if I'm paraphrasing this wrong, but in my view, you were road testing some of the wisdom about how to live a good life, proving some of it to be absolute nonsense and finding some of it to be perhaps surprisingly effective. And that's taken you on a really interesting journey, as far as I can see, of both helping others and, of course, your own development in terms of a flourishing life, what that means, and most recently into how we use our time, which, of course, is the subject of your most recent book and what we're really focusing on today. So I wondered if maybe you could take us on a little tiny recap on what's taken you to where we are with this new book.
Yeah, wow. I'll do the brief version rather than make everyone listen to a whole autobiography. But I think what's interesting to me anyway is that I think I started writing that column for The Guardian with a fairly cynical assumptions in place about how I was mainly going to spend my time, mocking self-help and sort of talking about how silly so much of it was. And plenty of it is silly, and I had a lot of fun doing that mocking. But really the big discovery for me was, really it was like a journey of increasing sincerity, because the big discovery for me was that it wasn't all rubbish. I'm sure that on some level I was drawn to that material sort of unconsciously because I needed some of the value that was hiding in amongst the rubbish. And so, yeah, as you hinted at before, like it's all been a sort of personal journey of therapizing myself in public to some extent, and sort of dealing with my own issues. And I think that's what I'm doing at every stage. When I wrote my previous book and when I write this one, it is about time, and I'm happy to talk entirely about time tonight. But in a way, I try to make the case at the beginning of this book that, like, if you think about it broadly enough, what isn't time management? Time management is everything. Time management is here we are for a few years on the planet, and how do we make the best use of that time? So I think always I'm really just trying to find different packaging in which to continue trying to find out, like, what the meaning of life is, really. And that column was one such packaging. And then this book is, it's a different way of coming at it. It's all ultimately the same.
And the book is called 4,000 Weeks, which I believe is because that's about the average time we spend alive. Is that right?
Yeah, ish. It's a little bit more than that usually, but I went for the round number. Yeah.
So let's dive into that a little bit. And in a moment, I'd love to come to the audience and perhaps see where we're all at with this concept. But I maybe it would invite you to share the main thesis of the book. But it feels to me that one of the things here is we all feel incredibly busy, and increasingly that there's a sense of there's just far too much to do and that we can't, really cope with that. Is that what led you to sort of focus on this particular topic?
Yeah, my personal involvement in this was to do with feeling too busy. I think it's important to say that I don't think busyness is everybody's time problem. I think, a lot of people feel that they don't have enough to do, or they're using up their time in sort of insufficiently fulfilling ways. But certainly for me, it was that sort of quantity issue that really dramatized it for me. And I basically spent years, as I write in the book, as a sort of productivity geek, as it's called, someone who's fixated on trying to find the best combination of time management systems and scheduling and work systems. It's especially something I think that people have a lot of autonomy over how they work end up doing a lot, because there's this sort of terrifying freedom of being someone who can decide to some extent how to organize the day. And I always thought that I was on track to some time in the future when I was going to feel in control of everything. I was going to be on top of it all. My life was going to be in working order. I was going to be able to accommodate all the demands that were thrown at me. I wouldn't have to feel anxious and insecure about where my career was going or my finances or anything like that. And I tried to do this by kind of trying to master my time. So that's that. And I think that's a pretty common way in which people try to eliminate anxiety and uncertainty in their lives. So that was my entry point into this. Although, yeah, as I do think that the book hopefully broadens that out to people who are not necessarily,
Well, let's take a moment to find where people who are here with us today are. So an invitation to all of you will be to say, what is it what's your own struggle with time right now? Is that too busy, work, family commitments, not enough focus? I'm just going to see what comes up in the chat, but please feel free to share on the chat, and Oliver, I'll read a few of these out. So prioritizing, focus, overwhelm, family, work, too many people, feeling burnt out, wandering mind, endless work, lack of headspace, unrealistic expectations, not enough energy, procrastination, everything changing.
I'm glad to meet you all tonight. Yes, brilliant.
Yeah, too much to do. I can't read them. They're so going so fast. Digital overwhelm, dyspraxia, feeling overwhelmed, can't decide between too many options, dealing with elderly parents, imposter syndrome, a loss of meaning in the world, too many emails, struggling to find balance, not knowing how to structure time, monkey mind, chronic fatigue. I'm also noticing, just to say, a few people mentioning in the chat that they're not hearing you particularly loudly or as loudly as me, Oliver. I don't know if there's any way of increasing the volume of your microphone anyway.
I can mess around with my microphone a bit. Let me see. Not too much. I've got one of these setups that hopefully looks very accomplished to everyone watching, but in fact involves a step ladder and certain things being balanced in a funny way. Let me see if that's any better. My mouth is a little bit.
Wendy has just said on the chat better, so I hope that means.
All right. Okay.
Yes,
sorry about
much better. Yes, lots of better. Thank you, folks. So, what do you feel seeing that list of time struggles that everyone's dealing with, Oliver?
Well, the first thing that I think about is watching that chat window is kind of a dramatization of some of the way that and trying to sort of stay on top of everything that's coming through from everybody is a kind of metaphor somehow for how it feels to be dealing with endless emails or endless demands. We live in this world of basically infinite inputs. This is a general phrase that I like to use. That can be things like emails you've got to answer. It can be demands from the boss or obligations that you feel from your extended family. But it can also be really good things, right? You can feel overwhelmed by having too many business initiatives that you want to launch or too many places that you want to go and visit. It's really interesting to me that actually this sense of overwhelm is kind of agnostic when it comes to whether it's exciting stuff or onerous, tedious stuff. It's just that there's too much. And there are lots of reasons for this. There are reasons we can discuss about the modern world making this particularly acute. But at the very base of it, I think, is just the fact that here we are, these completely limited creatures with a very small amount of time and a small amount of energy and a small amount of, talents in our own particular area or whatever. And yet we're capable of conceiving of an infinite amount of things. You can feel like you'd like to do or like you ought to do vastly, vastly more things than you will ever have time to do. And actually my sort of big critique of time management, as it conventionally is in the book, is that mainly what it ends up doing is sort of encouraging this illusion that if you can just find enough self-discipline and just find the right techniques, you can get to the point where you can do absolutely everything.
Well, in fact,
If the
reading
supplies
your
are
work,
infinite, it's not going to work, because that's
yeah,
not what
exactly.
infinity
Well,
means.
reading your work on this made me laugh at myself because it made me realize that the things I'd done to try and squeeze more in or use my time more wisely was actually just making me, more, the extra efficiency I gained just meant I tried to cram more in and it didn't solve the problem. So I guess maybe the fundamental core message is accepting this fact that there will always be more than we can possibly do. I remember someone once said to me, which very much resonated when I read your book again, was that when I die, there will be things on my to-do list. Throughout the rest of my life, there will always be things I haven't done, and actually being at peace with that is terrifying, but also quite liberating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the really deepest level here for me anyway is control. We want to feel a certain kind, or many people want to feel a certain kind of control over their situation. And if you're very busy, then naturally the kind of control you seek is to feel like you're handling everything and that you're going to get to the end of that to-do list. But people in different situations might feel that what control would be for them would be, other kinds of change to their life circumstances. And there is something about being a finite human who's going to die and who has not even just has a small amount of time, but only ever gets one moment of that time at a time, as it were, right? You'd have no idea. Nobody has any certainty about what's going to happen 10 minutes from now. And this is a scary, out of control situation to be in. But my argument in the book is that it is just sort of the human situation, and that actually by letting ourselves feel that a bit more and reconciling ourselves to it a bit more, that's the way to really enjoy life, to accomplish more, to sort of connect to the wonder of being alive. It's not to be constantly scrabbling to try to deny this truth about our sort of vulnerability and the uncertainty of life. And by the way, yes, absolutely, this was the message I needed to hear and internalize, which is, I guess, why it ended up.
I think me too. But at one level, it feels like what you're encouraging us to do is to be mindful in that broader sense of the word, of just be in the moment, live consciously, accept things the way they are, and then try to move forward. But at another level, it feels slightly more action oriented, coming back to action happiness, in that what I feel you're really saying is we actually need to make some quite tough choices about what we focus on. Is that how you've come to see it?
Yeah. I mean, I want to sort of meld those two things, the mindful and the active, because I think that if you really are mindful and maybe I would say conscious of the situation that you're in, you'll see that actually you're already making these very tough choices all the time. You're just doing it unawares. And so, if given that we have a limited supply of days, every time we decide to do anything with a day, we're automatically deciding not to do a million other potential things. We've sort of made a choice and we won't get that day back. And so, yeah, I think that what I'm sort of suggesting is that by owning those choices, by sort of seeing that because you are definitely not going to please everybody, definitely not get everything done, definitely not realize every ambition you can come up with, like you're better off, to the extent that you're able, you're better off deciding among those things than you are continuing to delude yourself, basically, that you don't have to decide among those things.
So step one is
a lot of traditional time management is about saying, like, with this scheme, you don't have to decide. But
yeah, you can do it all. Yes, but it's not true.
Yeah.
So step one is partly then recognizing our inability to do everything. But then coming from that, what you just shared, really, it brings me to something else I've heard you say, which I think's quite challenging but insightful as well, which is about the power of an irreversible decision, or making a commitment that it's harder to back out of, because in some ways that naturally narrows our focus and takes away some of those almost endless possibilities. Could you say a bit more about that and maybe give some examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of, in a way, one example is just multitasking, right? I'll get onto bigger decisions in a minute, but one thing that I think we habitually do to try to preserve that feeling of being in control of our time is to, like, attempt to do lots of things at once. everyone knows by now, I think, that it doesn't work, right? It's not actually a good way of getting things done. I won't rehash that, but I think it's interesting to see why we want to do it, and I think why we want to do it is because it feels like you're in control of your time when you've got a finger in every pie and all the rest of it, and actually getting past that and doing one thing at a time. We're going to talk a bit more about it later. We discussed just before we came on, but is one really powerful way to address that, sort of train the muscle in you that will allow you to just focus on one thing at a time. In terms of bigger decisions, I mean, I think that people, me included, absolutely, right, spend ages mired in paralysis about whether to commit to a relationship, buy a house. Not that that's even possible for lots of people these days, I know. To embark on a given career path or another career path. And you spend ages sort of wanting to keep your options open. Again, because I think keeping your options open feels like being in control. But what is the experience of people time and time again, and there's research to prove this, Daniel Gilbert and colleagues at Harvard have done this research, is that once you've made a choice that you actually can't back out of, there's an enormous amount of freedom in that, because you are no longer haunted by the thought that you ought to take a different path, that you might not be on the right path. Once you've made the move that closes off the other options, almost always there's this kind of lightness of like, oh, I only have one thing I have to do now, and that's just move forwards into the consequences of this choice. So I didn't used to be, but I'm a big fan of trying to make those commitments wherever you can bring yourself to.
Yeah, I mean, I must say I found that in marriage, actually, in committing to marriage and feeling a sort of lightness that came from, well, that decision is now done.
Right.
And that's great. And let's embrace this and make this the best it can be. But let's come from big decisions to the micro decisions we make every day. Because I saw something in the news this week, which was some research looking at how we spend our leisure time and then how those actions we do relate to how we feel. So they did one of those studies where they ping people to see how they're feeling and what are they doing at the time.
Yeah.
And they found that the things that make us most happy are some of the things that you might find actually happen as community members talking about, exercise, music, friends, nature, culture, gardening, that kind of stuff. But actually the things we spend a lot of time doing are some of the things that correlate least with, a good emotional state of mind. So texting, email, social media, using the internet, commuting, life admin. Some of those things we have to do, of course, through work and because it's admin, but some of those are our conscious leisure choices. So it feels to me that we're really bad at knowing how to use our time well. Is that something else you've seen?
I think that's absolutely true, yes. And I think there's plenty of research and plenty of like my own life experience to testify to it. I recall one study from a long time ago about how people, one of the things people think will make them happy is just sort of vegging out time, just kind of time when they don't have to do anything. Sorry, and actually what they find is that structured leisure time tends to be much more fulfilling than that. I think that the sort of the core issue here for me is that I actually think, with all due respect to the name of your organization, that asking what will make you happy is quite a sort of dangerous path. It's quite an easy place to go wrong, because we're so bad at knowing what will make us happy. Perhaps we're even really bad at defining what happiness is. This is my last book, really, but you seem to. It's the kind of thing where you can look back at yesterday and say, yeah, I was really happy yesterday, but in the moment, it's never quite the right word to describe things. So that's why I write in this book about, what it means to choose meaningful experience rather than happy experiences. And that again is a very weird word that is hard to put into to sort of define clearly in words. But I think that most people do have some kind of intuitive sense of whether they're doing something meaningful with a day or a week or an hour. And sometimes that is absolutely resting. It's not that it's always got to be something terribly accomplished, but there is that sense that yeah, I'm in the right place now, rather than like this whole thing is just causing my soul to shrivel up. And there I think it's important, because actually some many meaningful activities are not that pleasurable. There some of the difficulties you encounter in marriage or in parenting are just part of like doing it well, and you wouldn't want to just pursue pure hedonism, certainly.
Yes, and in that sense, happiness is really a combination of pleasurable experiences and meaningful experiences. But I think you wrote about a term, I see if I get this right, but you talked about rather than asking what might make me feel happy, but actually what might make me feel expanded. Was that the term you
There's
used?
this great question where, yeah, it's enlargement. It's from James
Enlarged,
Hollis,
that's
who's a
right.
Jungian psychotherapist whose work is absolutely great. And he says that, if you're facing certain choices, the question, would this choice enlarge me or diminish me, is a very good one. It works for a lot of people, not everyone, but it's the kind of thing where if you get quiet and you think about it, you very often do know the answer to that question when you wouldn't know the answer to the question, like, is this going to make me happy? Am I fulfilling my potential? All these other questions we ask ourselves. And I've had the experience of, being in choosing something or encountering some kind of difficulty in a realm of life, and being able through that question to see, is this the kind of difficulty that means you've got to get out of this situation, or is this the kind of difficulty that is part of growing as a human? And most people can intuit the difference between those two kinds of negative experience, I think.
That's really wise. I love that question. And building on that, in a moment, I'd love us to come and sort of pick your brains on some of your top tips, because of course you've been sharing great sort of insightful things already, but also I know you've got lots more. But I wondered if we might just turn back to the community again, because on this sort of general theme that's been coming up of there's always going to be more to do than we can do. A question that's been on my mind and the mind of all of us in the Action for Happiness community for a long time is something along the lines of what really matters in life. If you strip away all the kind of nonsense we're fed by consumer culture about a good life, and you tune into the stuff that really matters, then potentially we might live more wisely. And I think you had a really interesting question that we could think about to reflect on this. Something about, what if you knew there was, that there might always be too much to do?
Well, I really like this
frame it for us.
I really like this question because it feels a bit like those very upbeat questions, like what would you do if you weren't afraid, or what would you do if money were no object? But I like to sort of turn it negative and say, what would you do differently? How would you be spending your life now if you really took on board the certainty that there was always going to be more to do than you had time to do, that there were always going to be more things that felt like they mattered than you would have time to do. You could think of it in a single day. Think about what discretionary time you may have tomorrow, knowing that almost everything worthwhile that you could do with that day is not going to get done. How would that change what you did decide to do?
So let's follow in Douglas's example here, who's put more tacos, and share. I like that answer. What would you do if you knew there was always going to be too much to do and you only had time for a small portion? Rest, I'm seeing. Feel free to share these in the chat, folks. Focus on moments of joyful connection. Breathe. Go for a walk. Look for a new job, travel with good company, get into nature, create art, work less, plant a tree, write, be outside, run more, hugs, be like a child, be a good human.
Tell people how I feel. I saw going past. I like that.
Yeah, lovely. Garden, retire, pray, weed. I don't know if that's weeding the garden or smoking weed, but either way, it sounds like an ambition. Meditate, prioritize, laugh, write more. What else are you seeing on the chat there?
Yeah, journaling is one that I certainly make time for when I remember to prioritize well, because it makes such a difference to my life. Yeah. Think quietly, take risks.
So what's interesting there is people are not saying, people are not saying, earn more money, send more emails, check my Instagram feed. Again, it's back to this point that actually, what is it that gets in the way of us doing these things? So maybe we could just turn for a moment as to the very real pressures on our time and some of the ones that we create for ourselves. Because it feels to me that you're helping us realize that some of our choices we could be wiser on. But then let's also remember that people here have jobs that they may not be wishing they were doing. People have family commitments, caring commitments. People have issues of their own health and well-being they're dealing with. So of course, some of these things aren't really in our choice. So how do you distinguish between the sort of the stuff you accept and the stuff that you can choose?
This is a really important point, I think. I'm sometimes aware that what people might take from my talking about this book is, and I think it's a problem in a lot of books in this space, is the sort of presumption that everyone has the same kind of schedule flexibility as a writer. Not that I don't have tons of commitments and like parenting responsibilities and things in my life, because I do, but there is a certain amount of autonomy that I know is not universal. I think that much more than I think what I'm trying to do in this book, much more than saying change your life in these ways, which then creates the problem that plenty of people are not in a position to change their life in that particular way. I'm saying, see that this thing about your life is true, and see that the fact that your time is limited imposes certain truths on your life about the fact that you're always making tough choices about how to use time and all the other things we've discussed. So that, you know, even in the hypothetical situation of the person who had no choice and autonomy in how they live their day, which I think is almost everyone has a little bit more choice than they may think they have, however much that is. But even that person can make a sort of important internal psychological shift, because you can stop thinking that you can stop thinking that the path to happiness is to get on top of absolutely everything and to please absolutely everybody. And you can cut yourself some slack for those areas where you end up failing a bit, because you're always going to end up failing a bit. And so, and you know, somebody is going to be neglected while you focus on somebody else, and some emails are going to go unanswered while you focus on doing something else. And this is just baked in to the situation. And so I think that seeing the truth of it can be a real weight off people's shoulders, even if they can't make changes. And I think, you know, they can usually make a few more changes than they think as well on top of that.
I'd certainly agree with that. I have found it really liberating to wake up in the morning doing what I do and think, I can't possibly do everything that I want to or need to do today for my family, for my work, for my health, for my friendships. And that's the reality. So how can I use my time most wisely today? And as a people pleaser and as someone who likes to not let people down in general and not fail to do things, that was really hard recognition, but I found it really liberating. So you've already shared loads of tips, Oliver, and in a moment I want to come to all the great questions we wanted to ask you, but we love actions in this world, practical things that we can do. Would you like to share a few of your favorites that can really make a difference if we're looking to, you know, embrace our fallibility? I think it's the subtitle of the book is something like Time Management for Mortals or something like that. We're all mortal, we're all flawed, we're all going to mess things up. So once we've accepted we can't do everything, what else can we do?
I mean, mainly these ideas have to do with just seeing how you would naturally go through the day if you weren't haunted by this notion that you had to try to do it all. So I think one of the obvious ones, we mentioned it briefly before, is various different techniques and practices, but that are all based around encouraging yourself to do one thing at a time, right? So on the level of daily tasks at work, this could be as simple. This is a technique I saw someone talking about, as simple as literally writing down the next thing you're going to do in a notebook, doing it, crossing it out, writing the next one beneath it, doing that, crossing it out. On just these little methods to sort of keep you a little bit more focused on doing one thing, completing it, or getting it to whatever the completion means. It could, you know, you're not going to complete big projects all at once necessarily, and then moving on to the next thing. Really training in this, it actually it has the potential to turn sort of all of your life, certainly all of your work, I think, into a kind of meditation, right? So you don't need to just be meditating for 10 minutes in the morning. You can turn the whole thing into that. And so that is one of the things that I've really tried to sort of implement in my own life, to sort of tolerate the anxiety of making all the other stuff wait while I do this thing. And recognizing that that's kind of uncomfortable. It's not this kind of immediate glorious entry into pure focus and ecstasy that people might sometimes imply. It's like, no, it means no thinking in the back of your mind about all the other things that people want you to be doing, but right now you're going to do this one until it's done and then move on to the next. And of course you do end up pleasing more people that way. Not that people pleasing should be our goal, but as a matter of fact, you will get through more things
Yeah, well, on that note, I've learned that one trick, well, not trick, one important thing is to be able to say no authentically to requests. To say I can't do that. I'm sorry because I have these other commitments. But in some ways, that allows you to then say yes with more authenticity. But
Yes.
do we need to choose the things we're going to fail at, if you like?
Yeah, that's another of my. I mean, well, it actually comes really from an author called John Acuff originally, but it is absolutely consistent with all this stuff, and I love it a lot. The idea that it makes sense on a sort of seasonal or cyclical basis to consciously decide like some area that you're not going to try to be on top of for now. The logic goes, look, you're finite, you're going to fail at a bunch of things, or you're going to not get a bunch of things done this month, this year, whatever. So it's actually really empowering to decide what some of those are going to be in advance, because then you won't be sort of totally full of self-reproach and disappointment when you do indeed fail. A simple thing can be things like the level of tidiness of your house if you have small children, or it could be something that I sort of did this with, again, just a small thing, was like I really would love to, on some level, would love to learn to cook well, and I really can't. I can cook nutritious, passable meals for my son and my wife, but I can't. I'm not going to impress anyone with my cooking. And I've always had this sort of idea in the back of my mind that soon I'm going to find the time and the focus to really get good at this. And it was actually really liberating when my son sort of became a toddler and it became obvious that this was an ambition to put aside for a while. It was really helpful to like shelve it for a while. And it's still shelved, I must add. So that was actually freeing, because it didn't matter to me enough to be one of my sort of 3 or 4 things that I focus on in my life. It might to someone else, totally fine. It's a question of personality. And so it was very useful to put that aside. And on a bigger level, just on the same topic, I think I would say that somebody who has just had a baby, for example, is quite within their rights inside their own minds to decide that they're going to get away with as little as they possibly can in their paid employment for the next X number of months. Or maybe the alternative, maybe somebody starting out in their career as a young professional wants to sort of pour all their time into work and doesn't need to listen to the sort of cultural pressure that says like, make sure you have a balanced portfolio of activities in your life. I think that sort of seasonal imbalance, knowing that the other things will get their time in the sun, or in the case of me learning to cook well, maybe they'll never get their time in the sun, and that's fine too.
One of the interesting things in my looking at habits and behavior with the work we do with Action for Happiness has been observing that there are things in our lives that really do stick. And then reflecting on, well, how would we get the other things that we really value to stick more? Mm-hmm. Classic example being cleaning our teeth. Almost all of us have a routine where we brush our teeth every morning and every evening. It would be almost unthinkable to not do that. And of course, dental health matters, but so does our mental health, so do our relationships, so do lots of other things.
Yeah.
So let's say, for example, that we have decided that on reflection, we might let go of the tidiness of our house and our cooking skills, to use your 2 examples, and we might want to do more music or love or work we're passionate about. Have you found any ways that do help us build in those things that matter into our lives in a way that makes sure they stay nearer the top of the priority list?
It's interesting. I'm thinking about this all the time at the moment, because one of the big sort of interesting thoughts that has emerged from sort of putting this book out and hearing people's reactions to it is that a certain number of people feel like they underwent a real perspective shift, but now they really want to know, like, how do you keep that going all the time? And part of me wants to say, well, no, you've got to embrace your limits in that respect too, right? You're not going to keep it going all the time. But I think the other thing that's always worked for me in terms of building in these habits is, and it's in the same spirit, right, is a sort of deeply realistic kind of approach to building habits that acknowledges that we're not going to change on a dime and perfectly start being a certain kind of person, new kind of person tomorrow for the rest of our lives. So one of these ideas is this idea that from Dan Harris, who has the meditation podcast 10% Happier, who he's talking about meditation, but I think it applies to other habits. He has this idea of doing these habits, holding yourself to the standard of daily-ish.
Really is.
for good habits, because it is too rigid to say that you're going to do this every single day. And the moment, and if you do that, then the moment something gets in the way one day, you're liable to just like abandon the whole thing. On the other hand, what I love about dailyish is like if you meditate twice in a 7 day period, um, you're not doing it dailyish, right? In that case it didn't count. So there's a good sort of blurry middle line there. There's a slightly more complicated version of this I'm experimenting with at the moment, which is like to have done something a certain number of times in the last 7 days. So it's like a rolling 7 day period, but that gets a little complicated. Just things that are sort of ways of holding yourself to a standard, because you need to do that, but that are sort of deeply realistic about how these things work and how moods get in the way and life gets in the way.
In a moment, we're going to come to the questions. So if you haven't already, folks, and you've got a question for Oliver, please use the Q&A function, and please do vote on each other's questions so I can see the ones that you most want answered. But just before we move there, I love the thing that you've talked about and written about, which is about the sort of communal nature of this time problem, how that we are, of course, social beings, and altruism and connectedness are really much at the heart of our community. I'd love it if you could say a bit more about how our use of time relates to our sort of relational nature.
Yeah, I'm so interested in this. We have this sort of cultural ideal, I think, that the perfect situation would be that you could make all your own decisions about time and you could do exactly what you wanted when you wanted. And I write in the book about the sort of this idea of the digital nomad. This cultural ideal of the kind of person who can just up sticks, take their laptop wherever they want, go and work on a beach in Guatemala, run their online business, and be beholden to nobody, basically, in how they use their time. But of course, people who've done that lifestyle will tell you that the big problem with it is you're sort of really lonely a lot of the time, because you're outside of those rhythms and cycles of social life that make life worth living in many ways. You can't go for a drink with your closest friends because they're on the other side of the world being digital nomads somewhere else. And I think this is one thing that a lot of a lot of religious traditions rather obviously have had right. This idea that time has to be socially regulated in some way for it to really count. There's something really powerful about the idea of a Sabbath, about a day of rest, not just because you're taking a day off every week, but because it's the same day. And actually, you sort of have to do it because in certain cultures and times in history anyway, like all the shops are shut. And so there's something really beneficial, and there's research to back this up if anyone's interested, but I think it's also just clear, something beneficial in surrendering to some of those rhythms that already exist. I mean, in a very simple way, we couldn't be here tonight if everyone wanted to have total sovereignty over when this event happened, right? It only happens because, we all go along with the fact that it's going to be now. And that's a very small thing. I think there are opportunities to build more and more of that into our lives, that generally speaking, we've lost that kind of synchrony in how we live together, and it has a cost.
Yeah, so there's a benefit in changing our use of time in order to be more together, or to make space for that. I mean, the weekend being a really interesting example. I mean, I and my colleagues try and keep our weekends really sacredly for leisure and family time. We're working really, really hard in the week. And of course, that's one of those examples of a communal time bound thing. Let's come to these great questions that people have been asking. So Anna has asked, how should we deal with boredom? Should we be embracing it rather than constantly seeking more stimulation?
That's a great question. I think boredom, ironically enough, as many people have said, is so interesting, because we talk about it, and some people may experience it as a sort of very low grade kind of absence of interest. But really, it's very often a really surprisingly kind of aggressive feeling. It's like, it's really unpleasant to be really bored. And that is what, obviously, the attention economy is profiting off and exacerbating so well, right? It's like, it feels, to just sit and do nothing feels sufficiently unpleasant that you would rather get involved in some ridiculous social media feud or read about a celebrity that you don't really care about. And I sort of, in the book, I kind of explore the idea that I think this is because the things that make us bored, doing nothing, but also difficult work can feel boring. Spending extended time in sole charge of a 3-year-old can feel boring. I think what they all have in common is that they are times when we are sort of not in the control. We don't have the control over our experience that we'd like. And so we get sort of antsy, and yes, scrolling through a phone puts you back in the driver's seat. You're this little sort of god on the internet, and you can find out anything that's happening thousands of miles away and be whoever you want and all the rest of it. And to be in reality, either just sitting doing nothing or doing one of these sort of challenging tasks, is aggravating in a different way. So I think we do need to sort of let ourselves feel that a bit more, because I think that on the other side of that is, deeper immersion in those experiences. And it can be as simple as just reminding yourself that the reason these feelings come along is because you're doing something important and difficult and you don't have control over it. And so, doing nothing, staring out the window kind of is important, because our lives are just made up of these present moments in the end. And it's just good if you feel the boredom and you're feeling like you're going to be driven off into distraction. I think it can be really good to just interrupt that with the thought of like, oh yeah, this is what's happening here. I just want to feel like I'm in like control of my time. But actually, to be in the world means to give up a little bit of that control.
A questioner who just referred to themselves as R is making a really interesting point here. So referring back to you saying that it inevitably comes down to accepting that we can't do everything. But when it comes to work in particular, there's a lot of guilt and sometimes blame from others when you can't achieve the impossible of ticking off all the tasks.
Yeah.
So how can we manage that?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And sometimes that's a very real scenario. Sometimes people sort of conjure more hypothetical scenarios where, like, which I'm sure do exist as well, which is not just guilt, but like, you might get fired if you don't fulfill an impossible number of demands that are being made of you. So there's all sorts of downsides. I just come back to this point again, that like, if the demands being made on you are truly impossible, or at least even, truly incompatible with any kind of fulfilling life, if they're truly impossible, then they're impossible. And the fact that bad things might happen, or you might experience bad emotions as a result of acknowledging their impossibility, this is kind of a subtle point, but it's like, it's not because you failed to do them, it's because the demands are impossible. And so hopefully that at least is some solace, that there's some reason to feel less guilt if you see that, like, the thing you're feeling guilty about is effectively, it's a bit like feeling guilty at not being able to make 2 + 2 add up to 5, right? Like we don't feel guilty about that because we know deeply that it's not possible. I think the other thing that will happen, if you can be more conscious about the true situation of how impossible it is to get on top of everything, is that you'll make better choices closer to your own like sense of meaning that will lead to less guilt, because they may involve, either they will involve, spending less time doing work you don't care about and spending more time with your kids, so you won't feel guilty about neglecting them, or it will reveal that actually right now, in order to provide for my kids, or insert your own example, I do have to spend all this time at work, and then you don't feel so guilty about it because you've connected it to the reason why you're doing it, which is like for something that's deeply meaningful for you, which is to support your family. So we should not, rationally speaking, we should not feel bad about not being able to do an impossible amount.
But I love that point you're making about the sort of wider narrative, which is, I mean, I know people at the moment who are invigilating or marking exams, and that's quite a stressful thing, and it's quite a repetitive thing. And if you think about it from the kind of purely how am I spending my time right now, it can feel a bit overwhelming and repetitive. If you think of it through the lens of like, I'm helping young people on a path towards creating the best life they can for themselves, suddenly that feels like a really meaningful, worthwhile thing to do. And actually that narrative that you framed around your actual experience of use of time shifts how it feels.
And if that is true for you, that is rewarding, then you're in the right place. And maybe that there's someone who's been like, I don't really care about doing that in my life. And that too is useful information, because then you can see that actually it might be time to try to find a different role. Right. I think it's there are all sorts of things that we spend our time doing that are not fun, but that if you connect to the why you're doing them, you either see that they're deeply meaningful to you, or you can see, okay, well, now I know that this is something I need to try to move away from or minimize in my life.
It's sort of self-awareness and mindfulness. It comes back to it again.
Absolutely, yeah.
Clifford has asked, and welcome back, Clifford, who always asks great questions. Can you define what it means to waste time? And perhaps one person's use of time, like doing nothing but thinking, might be criticized by another as wasting time. But of course, that may be a deeply meaningful use of time for that person. So let's talk a little bit about wasting of time.
Yeah. Oh, I love this topic. I go off on a whole riff in the book, actually, because I think that one of the problems with the way that we relate to time in the modern world predominantly is that it has this effect of instrumentalizing time, right? So we're always living in the future or living for the future, waiting for the time when what we're doing now pays off in some way. And in that context, we get into this very ironic situation where we tend to classify as wasting time anything that doesn't serve those future goals. But in fact, that just means that wasting time is synonymous with being here in the actual moments of our lives rather than always serving the future. So I would say spending your life in ways that you don't value when you truly could make a different choice, that is wasting time. But that in the usual negative sense of that word. But there's another sense in which we sort of have to learn to get better at wasting time. We have to, I think, to be able to sort of, and I find this hard, I'm getting better, but I find it hard, to be able to go on a walk here near where I live and not feel like I ought to be back at my desk, not feel like at least I've got to use that walk to try to figure out some work problem that I'm facing or something. That's not easy. And I think it's because we have been indoctrinated with the idea that it is a waste of time, but it's the opposite of a waste of time. It's like, it's actually the truest use of time because it's being present to the actual time that it is.
Oliver, you've been very honest about your own struggles with this, and I think a lot of us can relate to what you've shared. But it's a nice chance to bring in this question from Angelica. You've recognized that, you can't do everything, but she's still asking, how do you organize your time?
Oh, me personally?
Yeah.
I mean, firstly, it's in constant evolution. Like one of the things I finally gave up on after doing that column for a bunch of years was that I was ever going to reach like the system for organizing my time that would last forever. I'm either too screwed up or just too interested in this topic to sort of let it rest. That said, the sort of one kind of keystone habit that I sort of make time for pretty much every day and have managed to do even through most of the parenting, our son is 5 at the moment, is morning pages. I make a point of doing that, even if it means getting up a little earlier than I'd like. That's probably not, I'm not recommending that people sacrifice sleep to journaling, but that sort of 40-minute period that I spend first thing in the morning before anyone else has woken up, hopefully, acts as a sort of a steering point for the rest of my day, and it matters to me a lot. And the day is not as good when I don't get that opportunity. I wrote recently on my newsletter about the other thing that I'm sort of experimenting with at the moment. Again, totally requires a certain amount of autonomy over your day, but I called it, because everything's got to have a name, I called it the 3-3-3 method, right? This was an idea that I was experimenting with, where I would try to spend about 3 hours of the day doing like focused work on my most important creative projects at the moment. Do 3 other sort of chunky tasks that I needed to get done that were not so focused or not so in depth, but that really needed to happen in my work. And then 3 sort of maintenance activities, I called them, things that keep things ticking over. So one would be like spending an hour going through email. That could be a maintenance activity. But also another one was morning pages, and another one was going for an hour's walk out in the hills here. So I was just thinking of this. The details do not matter. What was important about this, I think, is that it's it accounts for less time than I actually have. It's not an attempt to say like, if today goes exactly right, I'm going to get in all these brilliant habits. It's like, I'm at least going to do these things. And actually, that thing about only trying to do 3 hours of really focused thinking work, if your job involves, sitting at a computer and using your brain in any way, it's really powerful because I know not everyone's in a position to do it, but you get more done in the course of a week if you only do 3 or 4 hours of that kind of work in a day than if you try to do 7 or 8 of them in a day. I find that extraordinary, but
That's
it's true.
really insightful. And I find that I can often spend many hours doing the kind of admin preparatory task management stuff before I get round to that focus work. And a big challenge for me is, can I start the day with the focus things rather than leaving them until I've cleared the desk, if you like?
Yes, exactly.
Hard.
Do it first. Pay yourself first. I saw a few things going past about what morning pages was. This comes from Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way. But all I mean is, it's a narrow ruled A5 notebook, or it could be a wide ruled A4 one. And I just write for 3 pages about anything at all. Usually for me, it's kind of therapy-ish writing, but it could be creative writing. It could be, angry rants. It doesn't matter. It's like, it's just clearing out whatever is there, basically.
Irene Elizabeth, I can't quite, it's all one word on the title there, so apologies if I got your name wrong, but it's a great question. Isn't the Eastern philosophy of learning to be instead of having to do all the time a solution to this time quandary?
Yeah, if you can do it. I mean, absolutely. And I think those sort of Buddhist and Taoist ideas do run through quite a bit of what I've written about. I think that some people get in a tangle with this sort of this idea that there's a contrast between being and doing. And I think that one book that made a big impact on me is called The Art of Taking Action by a guy called Greg Krech, Krech, and that's designed to be a book that sort of takes this Eastern wisdom, in which he's pretty schooled as well, and explores the idea of sort of doing things from that viewpoint. Because I think that I know that the questioner probably doesn't mean this, but if by being you just mean sort of like sitting doing nothing or meditating all day long, then the reason that we don't do that is obvious. Like, this is not who we are. It's not where we are. We can't do this. The bills need to get paid. But there is another way of thinking about this, which is that where action becomes a sort of, I mean, I can't put this into proper words, if anyone can, but like, action becomes just a sort of natural expression of being, rather than something you're doing in order to get to the time when you can finally just be. And I think there's lots to be said for even just checking in with yourself about whether the process of the thing you're doing is something that you can find immersion in, right? Not just always focusing on the end point, but thinking about being present to the activity that you're doing, and questioning, if it's never fun and it's only fun in the moments that it pays off, then maybe it's time to rethink. I feel like I could answer this question for about 8 hours, and it would get more and more unclear the more I spoke.
My
why
own
don't I stop there?
No, that's great, and I love the question, and it reminds me of one of my own personal solutions, is the wrong word, but habits that have helped here. Is that I realize I am a to-do list person. I get quite motivated by trying to tick off my to-do list. And I can't remember who I borrowed the idea from. You may know, but whoever came up with the idea of a to-be list. So on my to-do list, I now have things every day that I have to tick off in order to complete my sense of, completing my day. And that includes meditate in the morning. It includes check in with an old friend. It includes take time to see how my kids are today. It includes write down things you're grateful for at the end of the day. So the things about how I want to be as a person are also on there next to, send emails and do all the other work things. And I found that really liberating, because it gives me some permission to focus on the be as well as the do.
I think that's great. And if you want a third list, I would also add a done list, a list of things that you have completed today, so that you don't spend your life thinking that it's always about things that you haven't done. And you can actually look at a list that gets longer during the day because of the things that you have done. I think
I'm even guilty of writing something down that I've done after I've done it in order to tick it off, because it gives you that sense of like, I did that thing, a completely pointless use of time.
I think somehow... a to-be list, a to-do list, and a done list. And as someone points out there, also a to don't list or a stop doing list, a list of things to not do. Great.
Very good.
All
Very
brilliant.
good. We're rapidly running out of time, but I want to come to Christine's question because I think it's something that lots of us deal with, which is guilt. And so we many of us deal with guilt in all kinds of different ways about not feeling good enough or that we're, able to be the person we want to be. But specifically in the context of time, how do we avoid feeling guilty for not doing in this world of constant busyness?
I mean, this question could, again, we could talk about it for hours, and it's so specific to different people. But I think that one of the messages that, it's not like I can give someone I don't know particularly permission to not feel guilty, but I think that one of the messages that I have found so powerful to experiment with in my own life, because definitely all this productivity stuff was wrapped up with my sense of self-worth, is like, could it be possible that in fact you don't need to change at all, that you don't absolutely need to get most of the things you want to get done? Need in the sense of justifying your existence on the planet, right? Could you let go of this existential idea that if you don't fulfill all these goals, you won't be enough? Obviously things need doing, you need to turn off the gas heater before you go to bed, and you need to cook food for the small child and things like this. But we carry such a big weight, I think, of this existential feeling that we're not enough unless we do this extraordinary amount. And it's so empowering if you can let yourself believe it, that like, maybe you don't need to do any of these things. Maybe it'd be fine if you're just as much of a procrastinator and short-tempered and distracted as you are now for the rest of your life. And what's so ironic about that is that that's when that's from that position that you actually can change, because then it's not like this thing you have to do to save your soul. It's just, sure, I'd like to get better at these things. And then it's a much sort of lighter experience to try to get better at them.
Well, that's a nice place to wrap up, because bringing that sense of lightness and fallibility to this whole topic is something that you've done brilliantly in the book and brilliantly in our time together today. So as a man who's focused on good use of time, we're very grateful that you've given us this time to help us think about this. And I'm actually also like to extend that gratitude to everyone who's been part of this conversation, all of the great stuff on the chat and the wonderful questions. And sorry for those we haven't had time for. We will send round tomorrow a follow-up email with a link to the video, a link to the chat file, so you can revisit all the handy things that people have been sharing if you'd like to. We're also going to send you a link to Oliver's great books and website, and also a fabulous last column you wrote, I think, as part of your Guardian series, which I think was called something like 8 Secrets to a Fairly Fulfilled Life. Was that right? Something along those lines, which has got lots of wisdom in it. So big thanks to everyone who's been part of this, but particularly you, Oliver. Is there a final thought you'd like to leave us with to wrap this all up?
Well, I mean, I think it's worth reiterating the one I just made. Thank you, first of all, to everybody who's here tonight. And I've seen so many interesting things scroll past. I'm looking forward to reading that chat file in more detail myself. I do think it is these twin ideas, right? Firstly, that like maybe it's okay if you never improve and you never change and you never become the hyper productive person you think you need to become. And maybe that level of acceptance could become the basis for making some changes, just because it would be fun to make those changes. And then I suppose the other part of that is something that I find very useful to remember, which is that when we do make these changes, they rarely feel great at first. They are counter-instinctual, as has been said. The things that are best for us, that we should approach in a sort of incremental and gentle way, but they're often going to feel like putting on ill-fitting clothing at first, because the whole weight of all your conditioning is opposed to them. So when I'm trying to do something new and it doesn't feel great at first, I try to remember like, oh, that's just the discomfort of like being a limited human trying to do things a little bit better.
Well said. And this feels like an hour very well spent. So thank you again, and keep up the great work. And yes, please do spread the word, folks, about this topic and Oliver's work, and all the resources we'll send you around tomorrow as well. Oliver, thank you so much. See you again.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Mark.